Hello, you're on the channel Almost Honest. Thank you for listening. I found out they were selling me on Wednesday evening. I was standing in the hallway and heard through the thin door. Barbara was talking to my mother. "The girl is smart," she said. "She'll manage." My mother said nothing. I've known that silence since childhood. It means the decision has already been made. I didn't walk in right away. I stood there for a moment, took off my coat, hung it on the hook, changed into my slippers. Everything slowly, because once I walked through that door, something would begin, something from which I wouldn't return the same. But first, the morning of that same day. Because to understand why I finally said yes, you need to know what my before looked like. I turned off the alarm before it rang. That was the point. Don't let it wake the others. 5:30 in the morning. In winter at 5:30, it's so dark, it's as if the night never planned to end. I got up, found my clothes on the back of the chair, the same order every morning so I wouldn't rustle in the dark, and walked out into the hallway. One bathroom for 8 people. I went in first because I was the first to leave. I turned on the tap. The water was cold. They'd turned off the hot water for non-payment back in December. It had been 3 weeks since then, and no one said out loud when they would pay, because everyone already knew the answer. I washed my face with cold water. It hadn't hurt for a long time. You just wake up immediately, no transition, as if someone had thrown a switch. In the mirror, I saw myself. Dark hair, green eyes, pale from lack of sleep. Someone at work once said, "Emily, you're pretty." I didn't know how to respond. Not from modesty. Those words just didn't carry any meaning for me. Beauty is something you have time to think about when you have time. The kitchen, 3 steps from the bathroom. The refrigerator opened quietly, the way you open something you don't expect anything good from. Half a package of pasta, piece of cheese hard on the edges, a quart of milk. I didn't touch the milk. It was for Mary's breakfast. Bread. I took out the bread, cut 2 slices. "Emily," I turned around. Mary stood in the kitchen doorway, 7 years old, wearing a flannel pajama with bunnies. Her hair was a mess, her eyes not fully open. In her hands, a stuffed bear missing one eye. "I'm hungry," she said. "I know." I made her a cheese sandwich, poured milk, sat her on a chair. She wasn't fully awake yet. She sat there blinking slowly, like a kitten. I looked at her and thought, she has Margaret's ears and Robert's nose, and this year she starts first grade and a decent backpack costs money, and we don't have $150 for a backpack right now. I didn't eat breakfast myself. No time. "See you tonight," I told her. She nodded with her mouth full. Work. Walk to the bus stop, then the bus, then another 5 minutes on foot, a grocery store on the corner, shift from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 12 hours at the register or stocking shelves, depending on who didn't show up that day. The pay was low but steady, and that mattered more than the amount. On the way, I thought, habit? You can't escape it. My mind worked on its own while my feet walked. 5 years ago, I applied to nursing school. I didn't get in. I missed it by 2 points. Margaret cried in the kitchen, thinking I couldn't hear. Robert said, "It's okay, sweetheart, next year." He said it and believed it himself. Back then, I almost believed it too. I wrote "next year" on a piece of paper and stuck it on the bathroom mirror. But next year never came. First, Nick went into the army, goodbye party, money for supplies, then care packages. Then Robert hurt his back at the auto plant, almost 3 months without proper work, just small disability payments. Then Sam got sick. Nothing serious, but expensive. Tests, medication, 3 visits to a private specialist because waiting in line at the clinic would have taken too long. I took my first job at a market stall, counting and packing vegetables. Then a second job, cleaning at a school in the mornings. I took that paper off the bathroom mirror somewhere in between. I don't remember exactly when. I sometimes take that old dream out of some distant place in my mind, on the bus or before sleep, and look at it not as a dream, but as an exhibit. It existed once. Now it doesn't. Life doesn't always turn out the way you want. That's not a tragedy. It's just the set of conditions you have to work with. The shift went as usual. Morning at the register, lunch standing up with a sandwich in the back room. After lunch, stocking new merchandise. My back ached, my feet hummed. I put on my coat, said goodbye to my coworker Irene, and walked out into the cold. On the way home, I didn't think about anything in particular. I just walked and looked at the ground. Wet asphalt, puddles reflecting the streetlights, a cat under a dumpster, orange, wary, looking at me without running away. I opened the door with my key and immediately knew something was wrong. Voices in the kitchen, not family voices. A stranger's voice, familiar, but rare. Barbara. I took off my coat, hung it on the hook, took off my boots, changed into my slippers, everything slowly, buying myself even a minute. Then I walked in. In the kitchen sat 3 people, Margaret, Robert, and Barbara. On the table, 3 cups of tea that no one was drinking. Margaret had folded her hands in front of her, the way you fold your hands in prayer or at a funeral. Robert was studying a crack in his mug with such attention that you'd think something important was written there. I've known Barbara since childhood. She lives in our neighborhood, goes to the same church as Margaret, works as a housekeeper in a wealthy home outside the city. She rarely visits. Her visits always mean something. I sat down. Emily, Margaret began, and her voice was slightly higher than usual. Barbara wanted to talk to you. I'm listening, I said. Barbara spoke for a long time. She started with prefaces. What difficult times we live in, how she's always wished our family well, how she's a direct person who says things as they are. I looked at her and listened. By the 3rd minute, I already knew the point. Not from her words, from the way my parents were sitting. The point was this. Victor Crane, her employer, she'd worked for him for 8 years, is a serious man, a businessman, wealthy. He has a son, Michael, 29 years old. A year and a half ago, Michael was in a car accident, severe traumatic brain injury. He survived, but not as he was before. He speaks with difficulty, walks poorly, sometimes uses a wheelchair, but he understands everything. That's what the doctors say. His mind works, but his body and speech are slow to recover. Victor Crane wants a wife for his son, officially with a marriage license, a young woman who will be there for him, live in the house, help him, care for him. In exchange, monthly payments to her family, good ones, health insurance for everyone in the family, a separate room for the young woman, and after 2 years, if she wants to leave, a compensation payment and her own apartment. Barbara stopped talking. I looked at my parents. You've already agreed, I said. It wasn't a question. I was just saying out loud what I could see. Margaret began talking quickly about debts, about the operation Sam needed, about Mary starting school with no proper clothes, about the heating bill, about the surgery Robert needed on his back that cost money they didn't have and couldn't see coming. The words came out tightly, without pauses. She must have rehearsed. I listened and looked out the window. Outside, a streetlight, wet asphalt, an orange cat. The same one or a different one, I couldn't tell. He's not all there. I chose my words carefully. Barbara shook her head. Her voice changed, became honest. He understands everything. He just speaks poorly and walks with difficulty. He's not aggressive. He doesn't drink. He's not ugly, just broken, like a machine that has something shorted inside but not forever. Robert looked up from his mug, glanced at me, then immediately looked away. In that glance there was so much, shame and a request, and something I didn't have a name for. He never knew how to ask. His whole life, work, his back, his family, and the pride that never let him speak badly of me. And there he sat, looking at me with that look. I didn't cry. I didn't accuse. Not because it didn't hurt. Some things hurt more when you say them out loud. I need to think, I said. That night I didn't sleep. I lay on my side of the bed. Next to me, Kate was breathing softly. She was 16. Little Victor Jr. was tossing and turning on a cot by the wall. I thought, not about whether this was fair or not, but about arithmetic. 2 + 2 = 4. The arithmetic of survival works the same everywhere. If I say yes, Sam gets his operation, Mary goes to school with a decent backpack, Robert gets his back surgery, Margaret stops counting every penny for bread, and I live in a normal house, eat every day, have my own room, and care for a man who is broken, but not cruel. This isn't love. This is a contract. And I know how to work with a contract. In the morning, I got up at 5:30, washed my face with cold water, walked to the kitchen. Margaret wasn't sleeping. She sat with a cup of tea staring at the wall. I agree, I said. Margaret closed her eyes. I didn't wait for her answer. I took my coat and left for work. The next day, Barbara drove me to what she called the viewing, her word, not mine, to the gated community outside the city. I had never seen houses like that up close. On television, yes. In movies, yes. But this was different. The iron gates opened for Barbara's old car, which smelled of pine air freshener and a little bit of gasoline. Beyond the gates was a real park, bare winter trees, a path cleared of snow, a 3-story gray stone house at the far end. I held my bag on my lap with both hands and looked out the window. "Don't be afraid," Barbara said. "I'm not afraid." That was the truth. Fear is when you don't know what will happen. I knew. There would be a meeting with a wealthy man who sees people as resources. There would be a conversation about money and terms. There would be a sick man in a wheelchair. None of that was frightening. Unpleasant, maybe, but not frightening. Victor Crane received us in his study on the first floor. A large desk, a chair behind it, 2 chairs facing it. He walked in while we were waiting. Tall, broad-shouldered, over 50, a hard, middle-aged face. He sat down, looked at me for a long time. No smile, no awkwardness. The way you look at an object you need to evaluate. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine." "Any criminal record?" "No." "Alcohol? Drugs?" "No." He nodded methodically. "Education?" 11 years of school. Didn't get into nursing school." He didn't comment on that. He just kept looking. I waited a second, then said, "I also want to understand the terms. What exactly will be expected of me?" He raised his eyebrows slightly. I don't think he expected that. Then he said, "Live in the house, care for Michael, be his legal wife, help with rehabilitation. You accompany him to the speech therapist, walks, daily care. Your family receives monthly payments. Barbara told you the amount. Health insurance for all family members, a separate room, meals, everything necessary. After 2 years, what then? If you want to leave, compensation and a 1-bedroom apartment in the city. If you stay, we discuss separately. And if I want to leave earlier?" Crane was silent for a moment. "We haven't discussed that. I'd like to discuss it. The contract should include the right to early termination with terms acceptable to both sides. Otherwise, it's not a contract. It's bondage." Silence. Barbara quietly inhaled next to me. Crane looked at me for several seconds. Then he said, "All right, my lawyer will write it in." "One more question." "Go ahead." "Does your son know about this conversation?" Crane was silent. That silence said more than words. "He knows there will be a wedding," he said finally. "He has accepted it." "He accepted it? Or you told him to accept it?" "Emily," Barbara said quietly. "No," Crane said. There was something in his voice. Not anger, something else. "Fair question. I spoke with him. He understands. I want to meet him before we sign anything." Crane stood up and left. I sat and looked at the wall. There was a painting on it, a mountain landscape done in oil. Well done. I thought, this man once loved beautiful things. Maybe he still does. He just doesn't know what to do with that. The door opened. Crane entered first. Behind him, a young man in a wheelchair. I looked at Michael Crane. The first thing I thought was, he used to be handsome. Not that he was handsome exactly, but something remained of that other person. Broad shoulders, good facial features, large hands. But his gaze was as if behind glass. He looked in my direction and also somewhere through me. His head was slightly lowered. "Michael," Crane said. "This is Emily." Michael raised his gaze and looked at me. I didn't look away. I looked straight at him. He opened his mouth. There was tension, effort. You could see how much it cost him. A sound came out, not a word. A long, broken sound that resembled something that had once been a word. "He's glad to meet you," Crane said for him. His voice was even, no pity, no false optimism. Just a fact. I looked at Michael, and here's what I noticed, and later, thought about for a long time. There was no emptiness in his gaze. I had expected emptiness, the eyes of a person who has something switched off inside, but there was something tense, something alive. He looked at me as if he were evaluating me, not me evaluating him. Him evaluating me, quickly, attentively, from behind that glass. I couldn't name what it was, but I remembered it. "I agree," I told Crane, "on the condition that we go over the contract with a lawyer and I can read it myself." That night I didn't sleep again, but I was thinking about something else. There are things I know about people. I know them because for many years I've worked where people don't think about how they appear. Cashier, cleaner, sales clerk. You watch them while they watch the goods or their change. The manager who talks loudly on his phone in the store but counts out coins at the register. He's not as rich as he wants to seem. the woman with an expensive handbag who pulls a shopping list written on the back of a receipt from her pocket. She has 3 children at home and counts every penny. Eyes say what words don't. In Michael Crane's eyes, there was something. Not illness, something else. I couldn't name it, but I remembered it. I'll tell you about the wedding briefly because it was a strange event. Too large and too small at the same time. A restaurant, about 30 people, Crane's business associates, a few of his staff, my family. My parents came, Robert in his only jacket, Margaret in a dark green dress from a thrift store. They tried to smile. Mary spun around next to me, whispering that I was the most beautiful bride she'd ever seen. Kate held her hand and looked at everything with wide eyes. I wore a white dress that Barbara had bought for me at Crane's request. A good dress, simple, without excess. Just right. Michael sat next to me in his wheelchair, in a suit that fit him perfectly. The registrar spoke the words. "Emily, do you take this man?" Michael opened his mouth, again that effort, that tension, and a long, unintelligible sound came out. Someone among the guests looked away. Victor Crane stared at one point on the wall. "Yes," I said. Clearly, toasts were made, businesslike, ceremonial, with the right words. Then Andrew Wolfe stood up. I didn't know him. I was seeing him for the first time. About 55, elegant, in a good suit with a dark tie, a face that people are used to trusting, soft features, a quiet voice, the ability to look at you as if you were the only important person in the room. He raised his glass and said something beautiful, about how Michael was brave to find support, about how family is what remains when everything else falls apart. Everyone applauded. And then I saw it. Michael was looking at Wolfe, not with the gaze he'd had throughout the evening, slightly to the side, slightly through. A different gaze. Long, still, with a concentration that didn't match his general appearance, as if he was remembering something. Right at that moment, Wolfe was speaking, and at some second he caught that look. His smile vanished for a fraction of a second. Something passed over his face. I wouldn't call it fear. Something colder than fear. Then the smile returned, and he continued speaking, and everything went on as before. No one noticed, only me. The first night in that house, I spent in my own room, as agreed in the contract. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked into the darkness, and thought about that look. What was in it? I went through options the way you go through keys. Fear? No. Recognition. That was the word. Michael looked at Wolfe as if he recognized him, and for a fraction of a second, Wolfe was afraid of that recognition. I lay down, closed my eyes, told myself, "You're tired, you're overthinking. It's only the first day." I fell asleep only toward morning, and even then something in my head kept trying keys. The first days in Crane's house, I settled in, the way you settle into a new job. I watched, I remembered, I made no unnecessary movements. The house was large, 3 floors, 12 rooms. I counted on the second day. Barbara handled the cleaning and cooking. A cook came 3 times a week. A driver lived in a separate guest house. My room was on the second floor across the hall from Michael's. My room was 4 times larger than the one I had shared with my 2 sisters for the last 7 years. The first few nights, I woke up from the silence. In my parents' apartment, someone was always breathing, or springs were creaking, or someone was talking in their sleep. A routine developed on its own within the first week. In the morning, I helped Michael wash and dress. That was harder than it sounds. His right hand didn't obey him well, and his balance was unsteady. Every movement required time and concentration. I didn't fuss. I didn't say things like careful or good job. I hate that tone people use with the sick and elderly, as if they were children who haven't yet learned to walk. I just did what needed to be done, quietly, without unnecessary movements. It seemed to me that was better. He noticed. I could tell, because he stopped tensing up when I appeared. By the 3rd day, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, a speech therapist came. A young woman named Vera, patient and methodical. She worked with Michael for an hour or 90 minutes, articulation exercises, repeating syllables, then words. I sat to the side and listened. Not because I had to, I wanted to understand what was happening, how it worked. After the speech therapist, a walk in the garden if the weather allowed. I pushed the wheelchair along the paths between the bare winter trees. And we were silent. We were silent a lot, but it was a different kind of silence. At first, awkward, the silence of strangers in an elevator, then different, just the silence of two people who don't need to fill every pause. In the evenings, I started reading aloud. It happened by accident. I took a book from the shelf in his room, the first one I could reach, and said, "Would you like me to read to you?" He looked at me and nodded. I read for an hour, then looked at him. He wasn't asleep. He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking at me, really listening. His face was alive, his eyes focused. "Same time tomorrow?" I asked. He nodded quickly, as if afraid I would change my mind. That was where it all began. Victor Crane appeared in the house infrequently. Business, the office, meetings. I didn't ask. Not my business. Sometimes we crossed paths at breakfast. Him with coffee and his phone, me with a cup of tea and a medical book about rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury that I'd bought at a bookstore with my own money in my second week there. He treated me with politeness and coldness, like staff he was satisfied with, but who wasn't in the circle of people he looked in the eye. It didn't bother me. I was used to it. At the grocery store, customers looked through the cashier. Andrew Wolf came once a week, on Thursdays, almost always around lunchtime. On his first visit, I was in the garden with Michael, pushing the wheelchair along the cleared path. I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me and turned around. Wolf was walking toward us, smiling. That wide, warm smile I had already seen at the wedding. "Michael," he said as he approached, "how are we today? Better, I hope?" Without waiting for an answer, he turned to me. "Emily, isn't it? Barbara speaks highly of you. How are you settling in?" "Getting used to things," I said. He crouched next to the wheelchair and spoke to Michael slowly, loudly, with exaggerated tenderness. "You're doing so well, Michael. You're so brave. The weather is lovely today, isn't it? The way you speak to someone whose mind, not just their voice, has been taken away." Michael looked away. At the end of the visit, Wolf said to me, "You're very good to have agreed. Poor Michael needs constant care. It's not easy to be with someone in his condition." There was something wrong in those words. Not the words themselves, the tone. Poor Michael. The way you speak about an object, not a person. With sympathy, yes, but also with something I didn't like. I answered neutrally, "We manage." He left. I went back to Michael, and here's what I noticed. When Wolf spoke, Michael didn't look at him at all. He deliberately looked away, to the side, at the ground, and kept his gaze there until Wolf stopped talking. Not from shyness, from something else. That night I thought about it. I remembered the wedding, that look. And I thought, I know something that I don't yet understand. 3 weeks after the wedding, I was reading aloud in the evening. A detective novel that had turned out to be good, dense, smart, with unexpected twists. Michael was listening. I finished a chapter and closed the book on the bookmark. Then he raised his hand and pointed at the book. I thought he wanted to see the cover. I handed it to him. He took it slowly, with effort. His right hand still didn't obey him well, but he didn't look at the cover. He reached for the table, picked up a pencil. I watched as he opened the book to the flyleaf, held the pencil, and wrote, slowly, crookedly, with pauses between letters, as if each one cost him a separate decision. I know. I didn't move. He wrote more. Who? My heart beat somewhere it shouldn't have. What do you know? I asked quietly. He looked at the flyleaf, then wrote again, long with enormous effort. His hand trembled. One word, me. The silence in the room became different. Who did something to you? He wrote one more word, then he looked up at me, directly. Wolf. I sat there without moving. I looked at the word, then at him. Are you sure? He nodded once, slowly. It wasn't the movement of a sick person agreeing, because he was asked. It was the movement of someone who had decided to tell the truth. Do you remember what happened? He shook his head. Not everything. He wrote, his face, a glass, then darkness. I stood up, walked across the room from wall to window and back. I was thinking. In my head, something was coming together that I didn't yet want to name. The accident. Wolf. That look at the wedding. Poor Michael. Weekly visits. Why would a businessman visit every week to check on a friend who doesn't speak and doesn't recognize him? Then I understood. He wants to make sure everything is as it was. Everything is under control. We don't tell anyone yet, I said. Agreed? He looked at me. Then he wrote one word, not an answer to my question, but something else. Wait. Wait for what? He wrote. Who to tell? I looked at those two words on the flyleaf. I thought about how he had spent a year and a half in that house, a year and a half knowing what he knew and having no way to say it, with that man coming every Thursday calling him poor Michael, and his father not knowing, the doctors not knowing, no one around him knowing. All right, I said, then tell me everything you remember, slowly, in pieces. Over the next week, we developed a system. I bought a notebook, a simple school notebook, graph paper, and put it on the shelf among the books, spine facing the wall. In the evenings, after Barbara went home and Victor Crane was in his study or out for dinner, I came to Michael. We sat together by the table and he wrote while I read. He wrote in pieces, exactly in pieces, because his memory returned that way. Not a complete picture, but fragments. A corporate dinner, a restaurant. Wolf came up to him at the bar with 2 glasses. Special cognac, Michael. Try it. Michael drank. 20 minutes later, he felt the ground give way. Not drunkenness, something else. His head grew heavy. His movement stopped obeying him. He wanted to sit down. Wolf said, "You should go home, Michael. You look unwell." Michael didn't want to bother the driver. He drove himself, on the highway, an oncoming truck. He finished writing and put down the pencil. He stared at the table. "Do you remember the taste?" I asked. He looked up. "Of that cognac? Anything unusual?" He thought, then wrote, "Bitter, not like cognac." I nodded. I wrote that down in my own notebook, not the shared one, but a small one I kept in my pocket. Bitter taste, a veterinary tranquilizer maybe. Something synthetic. I didn't know, but it was a lead. At the same time, I noticed that Michael was recovering faster than he showed the doctors. I realized this gradually, not all at once. First, I noticed his right hand worked better than I had thought. Then I noticed that he sometimes stood up on his own, holding the headboard of the bed, while I was nearby. Then he wrote to me directly in the notebook. "I am hiding it from the doctors and from my father. Wolf cannot know I am improving." I read that and looked up. Why not? He wrote slowly, carefully, with pauses. "As long as I am like this, he is not afraid. If he sees I am recovering, he will act. He needs me helpless." I thought about that for a long time, that evening and then through the nights. Here was the picture coming together in my head. Wolf wanted influence over Victor Crane. As long as Michael was healthy, there was no influence. Michael was too smart, too sharp. He would have seen through any scheme. With Michael broken, Victor was alone, consumed by grief, manageable. Wolf didn't want Michael dead. He wanted him broken. A broken Michael was his insurance for years to come. And here I was, a wife by contract, a caretaker, someone Barbara had brought in. No one knew that I had a good memory, a sharp eye, and a habit of thinking. That was our advantage. "All right," I told Michael. "Then we continue, you pretend, and I start gathering." He looked at me and wrote one word. "Together." "Together?" I agreed. Life became double. In front of the doctors, in front of Wolf, in front of Victor Crane, everything as before. Michael in his wheelchair, unclear speech, slowness, clumsy movements. Me beside him, the quiet, diligent wife and caretaker. No progress, no breakthroughs. In private, something else. His voice returned slowly, the way sound returns after a long silence. First individual syllables, then words, then short phrases. He spoke in a whisper, and it took separate effort to keep quiet what he wanted to say at full volume. I listened. Then one evening he said my name. Emily. 2 syllables, clear, recognizable. I froze. He looked at me and smiled for the first time. A real smile. Not a grimace of effort, not a polite nod. A real smile, alive, a little crooked. And I realized I was crying, though I didn't know when I had started. I turned to the window, pulled myself together in a few seconds. I know how. I turned back. "Again," I said. He laughed quietly, almost soundlessly. He said it again. "Emily." "Good," I said, and nothing more, because everything else would have been too much. With Victor Crane, we hardly spoke. We simply coexisted in the same house, politely, at a distance. He left early, came back late, usually ate lunch at the office. Sometimes at dinner he asked about Michael, how the speech therapist had been, what she had said. I answered briefly and to the point. He listened, nodded, left. But I noticed that sometimes he would stop in the doorway of Michael's room when I was reading aloud. He didn't come in. He just stood and listened for a few seconds. Then he left. One night I couldn't sleep. I went to the kitchen to warm some milk, an old habit from childhood. I brought my medical book about rehabilitation. I was reading it for the second time, underlining things in pencil. The kitchen light was on. Victor Crane was sitting at the table with a mug. He wasn't sleeping either. He looked at me without surprise, as if he had been expecting me. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. I put the milk on the stove. He looked at the book in my hand. "What's that for?" "I want to understand how to work with him properly. The speech therapist comes 3 times a week. The rest of the time, it's me." He was quiet for a moment. "And you read to him?" "I read to him. This is my second time through." I stirred the milk. "It says that with traumatic brain injury, the speech center can take longer to recover than motor function, or the opposite, depending on the location of the damage. What matters is that the person constantly hears speech and tries to speak themselves, not because they're forced, but voluntarily. That speeds things up." Crane listened. "So I read aloud," I said. "And I talk to him even when he doesn't answer. I just talk about anything." He put down his mug and looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "Not to me, into the space." His mother didn't live to see this. She died 3 months after the accident. Stroke. I didn't get to tell her that Michael survived. She died a few hours after his surgery. I don't know if she heard. The milk boiled. I took it off the stove, poured it into a mug, set it in front of myself, and sat there. Crane kept talking into the space. Not to me, I just happened to be there. He talked about what Michael had been like before the accident. Sharp, quick, 3 steps ahead. He talked about the first few months, how he himself hadn't slept, how he had sat by Michael's bedside. He talked about his wife's funeral, how he had been like a block of wood, not a single tear, and how for a long time he hadn't understood why. Then he understood. If you cry, it means you've accepted it. And he hadn't wanted to accept it. I listened. I didn't comfort him. I don't know how, and it wasn't needed. I just sat beside him in the nighttime silence of that big house, and that, I think, was what he needed. When he stopped talking and stood up, I said, "Michael is alive. That would have mattered to her." He didn't answer. He left. But the next morning at breakfast, he looked at me, not through me, not past me, at me, briefly but truly. That was something. Week 4, Thursday, Wolf. This time he stayed longer than usual. He sat with Michael in the living room, speaking in that slow, sweet, exaggerated tone. I was nearby, flipping through a magazine. Wolf was looking at Michael more carefully than before. Something was bothering him. I could feel it, not from his words, but from how often he shifted his gaze from Michael to me and back. "Emily, how are things going with the speech therapist? Do you sit in?" "Yes, always." "And how do you see it? Is there progress?" "The doctors say a little. It's a slow process." Yes. He nodded slowly. "Traumatic brain injuries take a very long time, sometimes years. Sometimes they never fully recover." In that last sentence, satisfaction. Not sympathy, not neutral observation. The satisfaction of someone who likes what he hears. Michael, meanwhile, was studying the pattern on the armchair upholstery. Disengaged, distant. After Wolf left, Michael reached for the notebook on the shelf and wrote, "He was checking. He's afraid I remembered." And below, "We need proof. My word alone isn't enough." I read it and thought, "The drug," I said. If it was something rare, illegal, he had to buy it somewhere or get it from someone. There's a chain. He nodded and wrote, "Rare, veterinary. I think that bitter taste. I read about cases like this once." "Good. Then we need someone outside who knows how to find these things." "Not through your father's security." He looked at me questioningly. "A private investigator," I said. "I'll find one." I found one through the internet. I sat in my room with my laptop, read reviews, chose carefully. I settled on an agency with a dry name and a good reputation on professional forums. I called myself using my own name. At the meeting, I explained, "I'm looking for information about drugs that can cause loss of coordination and reduced concentration, chemical composition, possible illegal sources." The investigator, a man of about 40, with the appearance of an accountant and the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal, listened in silence, then asked, "Is this for court?" "For now, just for understanding." "Understood." He wrote something in his notebook. "I'll work on it." Meanwhile, Michael at night opened a laptop, the one that had been sitting forgotten in the bottom drawer of his desk. He had old access to the company's financial system. No one had bothered to revoke it while he lay unable to move. He worked slowly. His right hand still didn't obey him well, but he worked. One night I brought him tea. He had stayed up until 2 a.m. I saw the light under his door and went in quietly. He turned, pointed at the screen. Numbers. Many numbers. "What is that?" He spoke well now, quietly, with pauses, but clearly. "Accounts, 3 years, fake contractors, consulting services to companies that don't exist, money going offshore." "How much?" He named the amount. I exhaled slowly. I couldn't even picture that amount concretely, only abstractly. Father didn't see. Father trusted him. In his voice, not anger, something else. Sadness that was older than anger. 3 years, he repeated. While I was focused on the work, on the company, he was pulling money out. I sometimes saw strange numbers in the reports. I told Wolf. Wolf said, "Don't worry, those are planned expenses. I'll handle it." I believed him. He closed the laptop, put his hands on the table, looked at them. "Are you angry?" I asked. "At myself," he said, "for not understanding sooner. You trusted a man your father had trusted for 20 years. That's not blindness, that's normal." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me. "You have a way of speaking that makes you hear yourself." "What does that mean?" "When you say something, you believe it yourself. That's rare." I thought, no one had ever told me that before. Not because it wasn't true, just because no one had ever looked closely enough. Spring came. I noticed it through the window. First the snow melted, then the trees in the garden budded, then everything turned green at once. In my parents' apartment, you don't notice spring that way. From that window, you see asphalt and a piece of the neighboring wall. Michael and I talked now, really talked, in the evenings. He asked about my family. I told him about Mary, who is now in 1st grade with a proper backpack, and sent me drawings through Margaret. About Robert, who finally had his back surgery and now walks straight and seemed surprised by it himself. About Sam, who had recovered. "Is that why you agreed?" Michael asked once. "For them?" "For everyone," I said. "I thought about you," he said. Before I could speak. "I looked at you at the wedding. You didn't cry, you didn't smile for the guests. You just stood there, thinking about something of your own?" "What did you think I was thinking about?" "How to get out of this with dignity. From the first minute, you weren't thinking about the money. You were thinking about dignity." I was quiet for a long time. "You're smart," I said finally. "You were smart." With bitterness. "You will be again." He shook his head. Not in disagreement, but in doubt. That evening, I was helping him exercise his right hand, an exercise the physical therapist had shown us. Squeeze a ball, release. Again. His hand in mine, large, heavy, uncooperative. He looked somewhere at the wall. "If I had met you earlier," he said suddenly, "just like that, in another life, what would that have been like?" I thought for a few seconds. "We wouldn't have met. You wouldn't have noticed me." "I would have noticed you," he said firmly, without doubt. "I would have noticed you." I didn't answer. I kept holding his hand and counting repetitions. But something inside me shifted. Quietly, the way something shifts in thawing ground in spring. Without announcement, without words. It just shifted. The investigator called in early May. The drug had been identified. A rare veterinary tranquilizer, used in large animal surgery. Illegal distribution was narrow, specific. Through contacts with one of the suppliers in the city, he had traced it. A year and a half ago, a man had contacted that supplier. The description matched Wolf. There was security camera footage from the pharmacy, not clear, but there. "Is that enough?" I asked. "For court, no. To begin an investigation, it's something. If there are other pieces of evidence, the picture comes together." "There are other pieces of evidence. Then we keep working." I put down the phone and sat in the silence of my room, looking out the window. The garden, early May, wind pushing white clouds. I thought about how half a year ago I had stood in the kitchen at 5 a.m., cutting bread for Mary's sandwich. I thought about the nursing school that had disappeared like a faded inscription on wet asphalt. I thought about the 2 points I had missed by. And then about Michael, who had written in crooked handwriting on the flyleaf of a book, "I know who. Wolf." Life is strange. Sometimes a door closes so tightly you don't see another one, and then one opens, and behind it is not what you expected. Not a prison, not a fairy tale, something real. I still needed to check one more thing. Wolf was a cautious man. He would find out something soon, or already had. We needed to move faster. I stood up and went to Michael. We didn't have everything ready yet, but soon. Very soon. That same evening, I didn't know that Wolf had already made his move. Somewhere across town in a restaurant where he was having lunch, Andrew Wolf looked at his phone. Someone in Crane's house, I never found out who, had sent him a short message. Michael's wife hired a private investigator. Wolf put down his phone, stirred his coffee, thought for a moment, then he dialed a number. "We need to move faster," he said quietly. "She's starting to dig." 4 months after the wedding, Michael stood up. Not an attempt to stand, not rising with help. He stood up slowly, holding the back of a chair, then let go and straightened to his full height. He stood in the middle of his room and looked at me. I didn't rush to him. I understood. He had to do this himself. And that was exactly what he did. Then he walked, first along the wall, his fingers touching the wallpaper, not leaning, just orienting himself. He reached the window, stood there, turned around, and walked back. Without the wall this time, through the middle of the room. Slowly, unsteadily, each step a decision made anew. But he walked. He stopped in front of me. He was a head taller, and I hadn't really thought about that before. He had always been sitting. Now he was standing, looking down at me, and on his face was the expression of someone who had returned from a very long journey. "1 more month," I said, "and you'll be running." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, quietly but clearly, almost without pauses, "I missed my own height." I laughed. I hadn't expected it. I just laughed, lightly, without a second thought, and he laughed with me. We stood there laughing at that absurd sentence in the quiet room, and it was more important than any words about what had happened between us over the past months. "Sit down," I said then. "Don't rush." "I haven't rushed for 4 months," he answered with that tone I was beginning to recognize, dry, slightly mocking of himself. "That's enough." Wolf made his move a week after that evening. I never found out which member of the household was reporting to him, a guard, someone from the temporary staff. But he found out about the investigator. He didn't know why, but he found out. He came not on Thursday but on Monday, which in itself was a bad sign. I didn't see that visit. He arrived in the morning while I was in the garden with Michael and went straight to Victor Crane. Victor called me in that evening. I entered the study. He was sitting behind his desk, hands folded in front of him, looking at me directly. "I've been told you hired a private investigator." I didn't blink. I didn't pause. A pause would have been a mistake. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "I was looking for information about drugs used for traumatic brain injury. I wanted to know if there are rehabilitation methods that official medicine doesn't use but that work. I don't trust when one specialist just says recovery is slow and offers nothing else. I needed an outside opinion." He looked at me. "Is that true?" "Yes." It was both true and not true. I had indeed been gathering information about drugs, just not rehabilitation drugs. "Show me." I took out my phone and opened a folder of saved articles. I really had them. I had read them, underlined them. The investigator had used this as cover for his real inquiries. Crane took the phone, scrolled through slowly. Articles, specialist forums, studies. He nodded, handed the phone back. "All right." The subject was closed. I left the study and stopped in the hallway. I exhaled. Then I went to Michael and told him. He listened. Then he wrote in the notebook. Old habit when something important needed to be recorded. "So he has someone in the house." "I know," I wrote next to him. "Who?" "I don't know yet. It doesn't matter." "What matters is that we speed up." He nodded and closed the notebook. "We need one more person," he said aloud. "A witness from that evening, someone from the restaurant staff who saw Wolf at the bar with 2 glasses." "The investigator is working on it," I said. He's working on it. The investigator found the waiter 2 weeks later. A young man. He had changed jobs since then, now worked somewhere else, but he remembered that evening. A corporate dinner for a large company. Many people. One of the guests, a middle-aged man in a good suit, had stood at the bar for a long time, taken 2 glasses, then moved to a quieter part of the room. One of the glasses stayed in his hand for several minutes before he handed it to a young man. "Is he willing to testify?" I asked. "In court?" "Yes. He's been told how important it is." The picture was coming together. The pharmacy security footage, the waiter's statement, the financial documents that Michael had printed and organized, 3 years of embezzlement, fake contractors, amounts and dates, the medical report on the nature of the injuries. Michael's own words. Michael's own words. That was the most important thing, and the most difficult. "Your father needs to hear this from you," I told Michael. "Not from a legal document, not from a lawyer, from you." "He won't believe it against Wolf," Michael said. "He will believe it." I was sure of that. "He knows you. He thinks he knows Wolf. Those are different things." Michael was quiet for a moment, looking out the window. "This will break him," he said quietly. 20 years of friendship were already broken by what Wolf did. You'll just be telling him out loud. He was quiet again. Then he stood up, without support, and walked to the mirror on the wall, a large mirror in a dark frame. He had never approached it before. I had noticed that. Now he stood in front of it, looking at himself. I stood behind him, seeing both of us in the reflection. "I'm different," he said. "Yes, different. I won't argue." He stated it as a fact. "I used to be arrogant. I thought I understood people. I didn't. I saw numbers, structures, business. I didn't see people. And now I see." He looked at me in the mirror. "For a long time." "It took you." I didn't answer, but in that silence, something was truer than any answer. Before he spoke with his father, I visited my own family for the first time in 2 months. Mary opened the door before I could knock. She must have heard my footsteps in the stairwell and threw her arms around my neck. "Emily, you're so pretty." "You too," I said. "Show me your schoolwork." Everyone who was home gathered at the table. Margaret, Kate, Victor Jr., Sam, Mary. Robert came a little later, after his shift. He wasn't hunched over anymore, not like before. After his back surgery, he stood straight, and that hit me in the chest every time, unexpectedly. Such a simple thing. He wasn't bent anymore. The apartment was the same crack in the ceiling over the sink, the same humming refrigerator door. But there were new white curtains on the windows, with small flowers, and the refrigerator was properly stocked. After lunch, Margaret took me to the kitchen and closed the door. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly. I thought about it, not to find a pretty answer, but honestly. "I don't know. That's not the right word, maybe, but I'm not unhappy. I'm interested." Margaret didn't fully understand, but she nodded. "Is he good?" she asked. "Michael is better than he seems," I said. Margaret looked at me the way mothers look when they see something they don't ask about out loud. On the drive back, in the car Crane's driver now provided, I thought about that phrase. Better than he seems. Better than he looks from the outside. Better than he thinks of himself on his worst days. And I realized that only now, in the car, watching the May trees through the window. Better than anyone I had ever met before. That wasn't love. Or not only love. It was something denser. Trust built not on words but on months of shared silence, shared secrets, shared work. I knew his anger and his bitterness. I knew his irony that had returned first, before his voice, before his walk. I knew how he chewed on a pencil when he was thinking, and how he looked out the window when he was tired. I didn't say any of this out loud. I wasn't ready to. But I knew. The conversation between Michael and his father was set for Friday evening. I knew Victor Crane would be home. He was always home on Friday evenings. I had learned that much. Michael and I prepared all week. He went over all the documents again. I made printouts in the right order. First the financial anomalies, then the investigator's findings, then the waiter's statement. A chain that couldn't be broken. On Friday at 7 p.m., Michael got up from the chair where he had been sitting deliberately for this moment and walked to his father's study. I walked beside him, not because he couldn't walk alone, but because we had agreed to do it together. Michael opened the door and walked in. Victor Crane looked up from his papers. He saw his son standing in the doorway, without a wheelchair, upright. For a few seconds, everything passed across his face. The things no one says out loud. Relief, pain, something that overflows and doesn't fit. He stood up from his chair, took a step forward, and embraced Michael the way you embrace someone you thought you had lost. Without words, just holding him. I stood in the doorway and looked away. That wasn't mine. Then they sat down. I sat by the window to the side. Michael spoke more slowly than he could now in private, but clearly, without stopping. He told everything. The corporate dinner, Wolf with 2 glasses, the bitter taste, the accident, a year and a half of silence, the notebook, the investigator, the financial documents. He spoke, and I watched Victor Crane's face. It turned to stone with each minute, not from anger, but from understanding entering a person slowly, like cold through an unsealed door. He listened without interrupting. His hands rested motionless on the table. When Michael finished, Victor sat motionless for a long time. "Andrew," he said finally. One word, not a question, not an exclamation. Just a name that had become something else. "Yes," Michael said. "We were friends for 20 years. "I know." Silence. Then Crane looked at me. "You knew?" "I helped gather the evidence," I said. He looked at me for a long time. Something in that look was different. Not as if I were staff. Different. "Why didn't you tell me right away?" he asked Michael. "I couldn't speak. And when I could, we needed proof, not just words. You wouldn't have believed me against him. My word against his." Crane looked at the table. Then quietly, "Your mother will never know." "No," Michael agreed. "She won't." That was the hardest part of the conversation. Not the documents, not the money, not the court. The fact that Natalia Crane had died not knowing, thinking her son was broken forever. That no one had told her, "He is alive, he is coming back. Everything will be all right." We were too late. I sat by the window and said nothing. Words were unnecessary there. Wolf was summoned the following week. Crane called him himself and said, "Urgent business meeting. We need to discuss the contract with the new supplier." An ordinary call. An ordinary reason. Wolf arrived on Wednesday at noon, left his car at the gate, and walked into the house, elegant, in a good suit with a briefcase under his arm. Crane met him in the hall and said, "Let's go to the study." Wolf nodded and followed him down the hallway, past the stairs, toward the study door. The door was open. Wolf walked in and stopped. In the study stood Michael. Not sitting in a wheelchair by the wall, standing in the middle of the room, straight, arms at his sides. Beside him, me. By the window, 2 people Wolf didn't recognize. Until he did. Police. I watched Wolf's face at that moment. I will remember it. Surprise. Then a second of understanding that passed through him like a wave. Then an attempt to compose himself. All in 3 seconds. "Michael," he began. "Yes," Michael said. "Me." Wolf turned to Crane. His voice was almost steady. Almost. "Victor, I don't understand what's happening. If there's some misunderstanding—" "Warrant," one of the officers said. Wolf fell silent, looked at the paper, then again at Crane. "Victor, you've known me for 20 years. Crane looked at him. He said nothing. And that silence was more frightening than any words. Heavy, impenetrable, final. "I thought I knew you," he said at last. Wolf was let out. At the door, he turned one last time to look at Crane. Crane was looking out the window. The door closed. Silence in the study. Then Victor Crane sat down in his chair, folded his hands on the table, and said, not to anyone, into the space, 20 years. Michael stood beside him and put a hand on his shoulder. He didn't say anything. That was right. I gathered the documents from the table and quietly left. The trial came next. I'll tell it briefly because the trial wasn't where the main thing happened. The main thing had already happened. The investigation took 3 months. Wolf's lawyers tried to delay, to challenge the security footage, to question the waiter's statement. They failed. The financial documents were undeniable. The chain of embezzlement was transparent. And when investigators gained access to the accounts, they found even more than Michael had uncovered. Wolf received a real prison sentence, attempted murder with aggravating circumstances, deliberate administration of a substance causing severe bodily harm, fraud on an especially large scale. His lawyers appealed. Without success, Victor Crane smiled for the first time in nearly 2 years on the day the verdict was announced. Not widely, just something in his face released. The way chronic pain releases, pain you had gotten used to. Michael officially returned to work. He called key partners himself, met with company leadership, walked into the office. He told me later about his first day, how people in the conference room looked at him as if they had seen a ghost. Then one of the directors stood up and applauded. Then everyone stood up. The house became different, not physically, the same furniture, the same hallways, but something inside had changed, as if windows had been opened after a long winter. I thought about leaving. That sounds strange after everything. But it was exactly then, when everything had settled, that the thought began to return insistently. At night. Michael was healthy. He walked, he spoke, he worked. His father was beside him. The threat was gone. I had come to this house as a caretaker. A caretaker was no longer needed. The contract said, after 2 years, you can leave with compensation and an apartment. Almost a year had passed. There was still time, but why wait when everything I had come for was already done? I didn't say this out loud, but Michael noticed. He came into my room on a Sunday evening. I was sitting by the window with a book, but I wasn't reading. I was looking at the garden. "You're thinking of leaving," he said. "No," I answered automatically. "You're thinking of leaving," he repeated. I closed the book and was quiet for a moment. "You're healthy," I said. "You don't need a contract wife anymore." He walked across the room and sat down, not across from me, but beside me on the arm of the chair by the window. He looked at the garden. "I need a wife," he said, "but not by contract." A pause. "You?" He wasn't looking at me, he was looking out the window. "Not because you took care of me. Not because you helped me. Because you're the only person I trust more than I trust myself. And with my character, that's not a small thing." I looked at him from the side, his profile, his straight nose, his slightly tight mouth, that same look I had seen at our first meeting and hadn't been able to name. "That's not a declaration of love," I said. "No," he agreed. "It's more." We were quiet. "I thought I could learn to look at you and feel nothing," I said. That seemed right, safe, and I couldn't. He turned to me and looked at me. "Neither could I," he said. "From the first day, to be honest. You walked in and asked my father if I knew about this conversation. No one had ever asked that question before. I thought, here is a person who looks." I didn't look away. "You didn't look away." A pause. "You're staying," he said. Not a question, but not an order either. Something in between. A request, with dignity in it. "I'm staying," I said. Outside the window was the garden, June, green, quiet. Another month passed, then something happened that I hadn't planned. Or had planned, but not this way. Not now, not in this life. For several days, I woke up tired. I blamed it on stress, on everything that had happened. Then Barbara looked at me one morning at breakfast and said nothing. Just looked with that expression older women have when they see something the younger person hasn't understood yet. I went to the pharmacy myself on foot, without the driver. I just wanted to walk, like before. I bought a test, went home, sat in the bathroom, holding the stick in my hands, and thought, life is a very strange screenwriter. I came to this house as a caretaker. I became a detective. I became an ally. I became a wife, first on paper, then for real. And now this, 2 lines. I walked out of the bathroom. Michael was sitting in the hallway waiting. He had seen me go out. He looked at my face. "Yes?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. He stood up, walked over, and put his arms around me. Not abruptly, not theatrically, simply held me, and stood there. I stood beside him and thought, I never taught myself how to do this, how to accept something just like that, without preparation, without calculation, just stand there and let what is, be. "I don't know what kind of father I'll be," he said into the quiet hallway. "You'll learn," I said. "You know how to learn." He laughed quietly into my shoulder. Victor Crane was told that same evening. He listened, nodded, stood up, went into his study, and closed the door. Half an hour later, he came out, walked over to me and said, his mother would have been happy. That was all. He didn't add anything else. He never knew how to add. I already knew that. But what he said, was the most he was capable of. I accepted it exactly that way. A few more months passed. Night. We weren't sleeping. My belly was noticeable by then, and at night I would wake up wanting one thing or another. Eventually, I would just sit and look at the sleeping garden outside the window. Michael would wake up with me. He had learned to feel when I wasn't sleeping. That night, he was reading a book about child development. He read with the same serious, focused expression he had once used for financial reports. I watched him and thought about something of my own. "Do you regret anything?" I asked. He put down the book and thought, "Honestly, I don't regret the accident. Strange, but no. If it hadn't happened, I would never have stopped. My whole life, I was rushing somewhere. Work, deals, numbers, ambitions. I didn't see people, I wouldn't have seen you. That's certain." "That's just a way of justifying what happened," I said. "It's the truth," he said. "Not a justification, a fact. I'm not saying it's good that it happened. I'm saying that something came out of it that wouldn't have existed otherwise." A pause. "And you?" he asked. I thought. The morning at 5:30. Cold water from the tap. Mary in her flannel pajamas. "Emily, I'm hungry." 12 hours at the register. The flyleaf of a book with crooked letters. The notebook on the shelf among the books. October in the garden when the leaves fell, and Michael said my name for the first time. Clear. 2 syllables. "I regret not getting into nursing school," I said. He laughed. He knew that wasn't the whole answer. "And nothing else," I said. That was the complete truth. No qualifications. The life that had begun as a transaction, the arithmetic of survival in a kitchen at 5 a.m., had become my life. Strange, difficult, with detectives and trials and nights in the silence of a large house, but real, the most real thing I had ever had. I had never allowed myself the luxury of being happy. There was never time, never even time to think about it. And now I sat at night next to a person I trusted more than myself, listening to him read aloud about how many months old babies are when they begin to recognize faces, and I thought, here it is. Not a celebration, not a fairy tale, just something real. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Thank you for listening to the end. If you found this story interesting, please subscribe to the channel Almost Honest and leave a like so you don't miss new videos.